In the unforgiving heart of the American West, a land that punished strong women by branding them outcasts, lived a soul named Eliza Thompson. They called her too fierce to love, for she answered to no man and carved her own destiny from the dust and rock. But her fiery intendence was a beacon for a different kind of man, a ruthless land baron who sought to possess her to break her spirit and lock her in a gilded cage of marriage. Her world was one of chains disguised as comfort, a slow death of the soul. That is until the day the plains burned, and a warrior of the Comanche, a man as wood and untamed as the land itself, shattered her world not to destroy it, but to claim the fierce spirit everyone else had tried to extinguish. This is not just a story of capture, it is a story of liberation. The dust of the Texas Panhandle had a taste, a gritty, unforgiving flavor that coated the tongue and settled deep in the lungs. To most, it was a nuisance. To Eliza Thompson, it was the taste of home. It was the taste of sweat earned breaking the wild colt in the north pasture. The grit kicked up by the hooves of the longhorns. She drove better than any man on her payroll, and the fine powder that settled on the pages of the ledger she meticulously kept long after the sun had bled out behind the mesas. At 24, Liza was an anomaly in the burgeoning town of Redemption. Her hair, the color of rich earth, after a rain was most often tied back in a severe practical knot, though errant curls always escaped to frame a face that was more striking than beautiful. Her eyes, a startling shade of green, missed nothing. They saw the weakness in a line of fencing, the telltale limp of a sick calf, and the predatory glint in the eyes of men who saw her ranch the Circle T as a prize to be won. They called her too fierce to love. The whispers followed her through the general store, slithered over the pews on Sunday, and were traded like currency among the bachelors, who found her independence more intimidating than a rattler's warning. She had inherited the Circle T 2 years prior, after a fever had stolen her father, a man who had blessedly seen the steel in his daughter and nurtured it. He'd taught her to shoot straight, ride hard, and trust her own judgment above all else. In his absence, Liza had not just maintained the ranch, she had made it thrive. But a woman alone, no matter how capable, was a target. The pressure to marry was a constant suffocating heat, far more oppressive than the Texas sun. And the most relentless source of that heat was Jeremiah Stanton. Stanton was a man carved from ambition. He owned the biggest mercantile in Redemption, had his hands in land speculation, and carried himself with an air of unshakable authority. He was handsome in a severe, clean-shaven way that made the town's other women flutter their fans. He wanted Liza, and by extension, the Circle T which bordered his own considerable holdings. Their union would create an empire. "Liza, my dear," he said one Tuesday afternoon, his polished boots leaving no mark on the dusty porch of her ranch house. He held a small velvet-wrapped box. His voice was smooth as creek water, but his eyes, a pale and chilling blue, held the glint of a prospector finding a vein. "A woman of your stature shouldn't be burdened with the running of a place like this. It's a man's work." Liza didn't look up from the bridle she was mending, her fingers deft and sure. "Funny, Jeremiah. The cattle don't seem to mind. The books balance just fine. And this bridle seems to be coming together without the benefit of a man's touch." His smile tightened. A jest. "You have a fiery wit. It's one of the things I admire." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her work. "But this is a dangerous land. The Comanche are restless. Raids have been reported not 20 miles east. A husband provides protection. A husband provides legitimacy. He opened the box. Inside a diamond ring glittered cold and sharp. It was a beautiful, expensive trap. Liza finally looked at him, her green eyes as hard as jade. My legitimacy. Jeremiah comes from the brand on my cattle and the deed in my father's lockbox. My protection comes from the Winchester over my door and the 6-shooter on my hip. I have no need for the kind of protection you're offering. Stanton's facade cracked for a moment. A flicker of raw anger crossed his face before being smoothed away. He was a patient man. He snapped the box shut. You'll come around, Liza. Every woman does. A soul as wild as yours needs a firm hand to guide it. He placed the box on the railing. Consider it a promise of the future we will have. He left, and Liza watched him go, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. He wasn't proposing. He was issuing a threat. He was a different kind of cage one, with polished bars and the veneer of respectability, but a cage nonetheless. She was already in chains. She realized the chains of society's expectations of her gender, of Stanton's relentless, suffocating ambition. The rumors of the Comanche were true. They were a ghost people spoken of in hushed, fearful tones. The Nocona Comanche, they were called. Led by a war chief, the Mexicans had named Kento Como, the Black Hawk. They said he was more spirit than man, that he moved through the plains unseen, that his warriors struck with the ferocity of a summer storm. They were a people pushed to the brink, their lands shrinking, the buffalo disappearing, their treaties with the white men worth less than the paper they were written on. Their desperation had turned to rage. A week after Stanton's visit, Liza was riding the southern fence line with her most trusted hand, a grizzled old-timer named Silas, whose face was a road map of tough years. The air was unnaturally still, the sky a vast, empty blue. Even the insects seemed to have fallen silent. "Something ain't right," Silas muttered, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Feels like the whole world's holding its breath." Liza felt it too, a primal hum of wrongness in the air. She reined in her mare, Patsy, her hand instinctively dropping to the colt at her hip. They were miles from the ranch house, in a shallow arroyo dotted with mesquite and prickly pear. The silence was shattered not by a sound, but by a movement, a flicker on the ridge to the east, then another. They weren't heat shimmers. They were riders appearing as if summoned from the earth itself. Painted ponies, eagle feathers in their hair, their bronze skin blending with the sun-baked land. Comanche. Liza ride, Silas yelled, drawing his own pistol. "Ride for the house. Don't stop for nothing." But it was too late. More riders appeared from the west, cutting off their retreat. They were caught. There were at least a dozen of them, forming a loose, tightening circle. Their faces were grim masks of war paint, their eyes holding a terrifying, ancient fury. Liza's heart hammered against her ribs, but the terror was shot through with a cold, defiant rage. She would not be taken easily. She drew her colt, the familiar weight a small comfort in a world suddenly tilted on its axis. Silas fired first, his shot echoing in the sudden quiet. A warrior's horse screamed and went down. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A hail of arrows whispered through the air. One thudded into Silas's chest, and he slumped from his saddle with a soft groan his life over before he hit the ground. A searing pain erupted in Liza's left shoulder as another arrow sliced through flesh and muscle. The shock of it almost made her drop her gun. Her mare Patsy screamed and reared, terrified. Liza fought to control her, firing a shot that went wide. A warrior on a powerful black horse broke from the circle and charged. He was different from the others, taller, broader in the shoulder, with a presence that commanded the chaotic scene. His face was streaked with black and red paint, but it couldn't hide the sharp intelligence in his dark, piercing eyes, or the cruel set of his mouth. An eagle feather was tied in his long black hair. This had to be him. Black Hawk. He reached her in a matter of seconds. He didn't use a weapon. With a fluid, powerful motion, he leaned from his saddle, and his arms snaked around her waist, lifting her from her own horse as if she weighed nothing. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. Her gun fell to the dust. She was thrown face down across the front of his saddle, the rough leather scraping her cheek, the smell of horse and sweat and something wood and male filling her senses. She struggled, kicking and twisting, her rage a living fire inside her. "Let me go! Damn you to hell! Let me go!" she screamed, her voice hoarse. Her struggling earned her a sharp, brutal blow to the back of her head. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain, and then mercifully there was only darkness. The last thing she was aware of was the powerful, rhythmic movement of the horse carrying her away from the ruins of her life, a captive in the arms of a ruthless savage. Her old chains broken only to be replaced by new ones made of leather and steel. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a violent, throbbing intrusion. Every muscle in Liza's body ached. Her head felt as if it had been split by an axe, and the arrow wound in her shoulder was a beacon of pure agony. She was lying on her side, her cheek pressed against the hard, unforgiving ground. The smell of sagebrush and dry earth filled her nostrils. She tried to move, but her hands were bound tightly behind her back with rawhide that cut into her wrists. She cracked her eyes open. The world was a blur of motion. She was in a temporary camp, a shallow basin, hidden from the open plains. The Comanche warriors moved with a quiet, purposeful efficiency, tending to their horses, checking their weapons. The sun was low in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters. Her heart seized with a cold, primal fear. This was real. The stories whispered in redemption were no longer tales to frighten children. They were her terrifying reality. She pushed herself into a sitting position, ignoring the wave of nausea that washed over her. Her gaze swept the camp, searching for him. She found him easily. Black Hawk stood apart from the others, staring east, the direction they had come from. He was holding something in his hands, something he'd taken from her ranch. It wasn't jewelry or money. It was her father's leather-bound ledger. The sight of it sent a jolt of pure fury through her, momentarily eclipsing her fear. He had no right. That ledger held the soul of the Circle T, every transaction, every birth and death of livestock. Her father's scrawled notes in the margins. It was a history, her history. He seemed to feel her gaze. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes locking onto hers from across the clearing. There was no triumph in his expression, no gloating. There was something else, something cold and appraising, like a wolf studying its prey, trying to understand its nature before the kill. He tucked the ledger into a leather satchel on his horse and walked toward her. Liza scrambled backward, her bound hands digging into the rocky soil. She would not show him her fear. She met his gaze with all the defiance she could muster, her green eyes blazing. "What do you want?" She spat, her voice a dry rasp. He stopped a few feet from her, towering over her. He didn't answer immediately. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, and then his gaze fell to her shoulder. The sleeve of her blouse was soaked in blood, the area around the wound swollen and angry-looking. Without a word, he turned and spoke to another warrior in the low, guttural tones of the Comanche language. The man returned a moment later with a waterskin and a strip of clean-looking hide. Black Hawk knelt in front of her. Liza flinched away. "Don't touch me." He ignored her, his movements economical and precise. He took a knife from his belt, the blade long and wicked-looking, and for a terrifying moment she thought he meant to kill her. Instead, he used the tip to carefully slice through the fabric of her sleeve, exposing the wound. The arrow had torn through the muscle, leaving a ragged, bleeding gash. He poured water over it, and she hissed in pain as the cold liquid hit the raw flesh. He then took a small leather pouch from his belt, sprinkled a dark, herbal powder into the wound, and bound it tightly with the strip of hide. His touch was surprisingly gentle, impersonal, the way a man might treat a valuable piece of livestock. The thought was infuriating. When he was done, he sat back on his heels. He finally spoke his English, heavily accented but clear. "You have spirit, like a wild mustang. They must be broken to be useful." "I will not be broken." She seethed the words, tasting like acid. "Not by you. Not by anyone." A flicker of something, was it? Amusement? Respect passed through his eyes. "We will see." He stood and turned to walk away. Why she called after him, the question torn from her throat. Why my ranch? There are others bigger, richer. Why me? He paused but didn't turn around. Your ranch was not the target. Your fiancé was. He said the word fiancé with a venom that startled her. Jeremiah Stanton. He was to be at your ranch today. My scouts watched him visit you many times. They heard the talk in your town. The wedding was soon. Liza's blood ran cold. This wasn't a random raid for plunder. It was a targeted attack. They hadn't come for her. They had come for Jeremiah. "What business do you have with Jeremiah Stanton?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. This time he did turn, and the look on his face chilled her to the bone. The mask of the stoic warrior was gone, replaced by a raw, burning hatred that was terrifying in its intensity. "He is a butcher and a thief." Black Hawk said, his voice low and dangerous. "He trades in lies and builds his empire on the blood of my people. Last winter, when the snows were deep and my people starved because the buffalo your kind slaughtered were gone, Stanton sold us rancid flour and spoiled meat. Many of our children died." He took a step closer, his eyes boring into hers. "But that is not the extent of his crimes. 3 moons ago, a party of my hunters, led by my younger brother White Eagle, went to trade for horses. They met with Stanton's men. There was a disagreement. Stanton's men opened fire. They killed them all. For a handful of horses." His voice broke with a grief so profound, it was a physical blow. "They took my brother's scalp as a trophy. I have sworn an oath on his grave. Jeremiah Stanton will pay for what he has done. He will lose everything he values, just as I have." Liza stared at him, her mind reeling. Jeremiah. The respectable, ambitious man who brought her diamond rings and spoke of legitimacy. A murderer, a man who sold poisoned food to starving people. It was impossible. It had to be a lie, a savage's excuse for his own barbarism. And yet, She remembered the coldness in Jeremiah's pale blue eyes, the flicker of anger when she defied him, his relentless need for control. She thought of how he spoke of the Comanche not as people, but as obstacles, vermin to be cleared from the land he coveted. The journey that followed was a waking nightmare. They rode for days, moving north deeper into the vast, empty expanse of the Comancheria. Liza was tied to a spare horse, a lead rope held by the warrior who had tended her wound. They moved with relentless speed, pausing only for brief rests. She was given water and a little dried meat, just enough to keep her going. The pain in her shoulder was a constant throbbing presence, and her body screamed with exhaustion. But worse than the physical misery was the turmoil in her mind. Black Hawk's words echoed in her thoughts, warring with everything she had ever known. She watched him as they rode. He was a creature of this land, as much a part of it as the hawks that circled in the sky above. He read the terrain, the sky, the tracks in the dust, with an instinct she could only marvel at. He led his men with an unspoken authority that had nothing to do with threats or force, but with an innate, unshakable confidence. He rarely spoke to her again after that first night, but she felt his eyes on her. When she stumbled with exhaustion, he would call a halt. When her water was low, a skin would be passed to her. It wasn't kindness, it was preservation. She was a tool, a piece of his revenge against Jeremiah Stanton. A pawn in a deadly game she was only just beginning to understand. One evening as they made camp, she overheard a conversation. A younger warrior was questioning Black Hawk, his tone urgent. Liza had started to pick out a few words, and combined with their gestures, she pieced together the meaning. The young warrior was pointing back the way they came. He was worried about being followed. Black Hawk's response was sharp. He pointed north, then made a gesture that was unmistakable. Stanton. He then pointed at Liza. He was explaining his plan. He was using her as bait. He knew Jeremiah knew his possessive nature. Stanton wouldn't see her as a lost love. He would see her as stolen property. He would come for her. And when he did, Black Hawk would be waiting. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just a captive. She was the lure in a trap. Her life was the price of Black Hawk's vengeance. And as they rode deeper into the heart of a hostile land, Liza knew that her old world, the world of the Circle T and the town of redemption, was unraveling completely, leaving her terrifyingly, utterly alone. The main Comanche encampment, or rancheria, was nestled in the protective curve of a canyon wall, hidden from the prying eyes of the plains. It was a sprawling, chaotic, and vibrant place. Smoke from dozens of cook fires spiraled into the impossibly blue sky. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke roasting meat and tanning hides. Dogs barked, children shouted and played, and the rhythmic thud of a drum echoed from somewhere in the camp. Tepees made from tanned buffalo hides and decorated with painted symbols and histories stood in a great circle. Liza's arrival caused an immediate stir. She was led through the camp, the object of 100 hostile, curious stares. Women stopped their work to watch her pass, their dark eyes filled with suspicion and contempt. She was the enemy, a symbol of the white world that was destroying theirs. She kept her head held high, her spine straight, refusing to cower. Her defiance was a thin shield, but it was all she had. She was taken to a teepee near the center of the camp, presumably Black Hawk's, and her lead rope was tied to a stake outside. She was a prisoner, tethered like an animal. The humiliation stung, but she swallowed her pride. For the first few days, she was largely ignored. She was given food, a gritty corn mush, and tough smoked meat and water, but no one spoke to her. She was an object, a ghost in their world. The days were a torment of boredom and anxiety. She watched the life of the camp, her senses on high alert. She saw the women, their hands never idle, scraping hides, sewing clothes with bone needles, tending to children. She saw the old men, their faces like cracked leather smoking pipes and telling stories. She saw the boys practicing with small bows, their games a rehearsal for the warrior's life that awaited them. And she watched Black Hawk. He was not a chief in the way a white man would understand it. His authority came from respect, not command. He moved through the camp, speaking with the elders, training the young warriors, his presence a steadying force. She saw him with his family, a sister, a mother. And in those moments, the ruthless warrior seemed to vanish, replaced by a son and a brother. It was a confusing, contradictory image that chipped away at the simple, terrifying picture of the savage who had captured her. Her first flicker of human connection came from an unexpected source. An old woman, her face a beautiful web of wrinkles, and her hair, two long silver braids, began to leave a small bowl of berry-sweetened mush for her each morning, a small improvement on the bland food she was usually given. She would set it down without a word and walk away. Liza learned her name was Kantasika, which meant sad heart. The others called her She Who Remembers, for she was the keeper of the tribe's oral history. One afternoon, as Liza was trying to ease the ache in her shoulder, the old woman approached and sat down cross-legged a few feet away. She pointed to Liza's bound hands. "Hurts," the old woman said, her English as worn and soft as old buckskin. Liza nodded, surprised. "Yes." The old woman pointed to her own heart. "Hurts." She then made a gesture like a bird flying away. "My son." White Eagle. Liza's breath caught in her throat. This was Black Hawk's mother, the mother of the boy Jeremiah's men had killed. The grief in the woman's eyes was a bottomless well. It was not the angry, vengeful grief of her other son, but a quiet, enduring sorrow that seemed to have settled into her very bones. Looking at this woman, Liza felt the first crack in her certainty. The story Black Hawk had told her. Could it be true? The pain in this mother's eyes felt more real than any of Jeremiah's polished promises. She Who Remembers began to talk to her in a mix of broken English and Comanche. She pointed to things and named them. Mato bear, Sunka dog, Peta fire. Liza, desperate for any distraction, began to learn. The words were strange on her tongue, but they were a bridge, however fragile, across the chasm of hatred that separated her from these people. A week later, Black Hawk approached her again. He had been away for 2 days with a scouting party. He carried the rawhide rope that bound her to the stake. "You have not tried to run," he stated, his eyes searching her face. "Where would I run?" she countered, her voice bitter. "To die of thirst in the desert. To be eaten by wolves, you've made sure I have no escape." "A smart captive knows when to wait," he said. He knelt, and to her utter astonishment, used his knife to cut the rawhide from the stake. He did not untie her hands. "You will work with my mother. It is not good to be idle." She was being put to work, but it was also a small, grudging grant of freedom. The freedom to move around the camp, at least. She was led to She Who Remembers, who put her to work grinding corn on a flat stone. The work was hard, repetitive, and blistered her soft hands, but it was better than the crippling idleness. As she worked, she listened. She learned. She began to understand the rhythm of their lives, a life dictated by the seasons, the hunt, and the constant threat of their enemies. She learned that Nokona was not a name, but a word for wanderers, a poignant descriptor for a people who were being relentlessly pushed from their ancestral lands. One evening, as the last light of the sun painted the canyon walls in shades of orange and purple, Black Hawk sought her out. He was carrying her father's ledger. He sat down near the fire where she was helping his mother cook. "Your father was a good man," he said, startling her. "His notes. He writes of the land with respect. He writes of a Comanche family he helped one winter, gave them a blanket and food. He did not cheat them." Liza looked up, her heart aching at the mention of her father. He was. He believed you could share the land. That belief died with him. Black Hawk said, his voice hard. He opened the ledger. "Stanton, he made you an offer for your land. Before my warriors came. It is written here. You refused. It's my home," she said simply. "To him it is just property." "A line on a map," Black Hawk said. He tapped a page in the ledger. "Here. He sold rifles to the Kiowa, our sworn enemies. He profits from the war between tribes. And here." His finger traced a line of her father's meticulous script. An entry about a sale of cattle to the army, but with a note scrawled next to it. "Stanton underbid using shoddy goods. Watch him." Every word, every entry he pointed out, was another stone dislodged from the foundation of her world. Jeremiah was not just a murderer. He was a war profiteer, a cheat, a man who built his wealth on the misery of others, white and native alike. The man she had almost married was a monster. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because you must understand," he said, his dark eyes intense in the firelight. "This is not just about my brother. This is about a sickness. The sickness of greed. It is in men like Stanton. It poisons everything it touches. It poisons the land. It poisons my people, and it will poison you." He closed the book and held it out to her. "This is yours." She took it, her fingers brushing his. A jolt like lightning shot up her arm. It was the first time they had touched since her capture, the first time their contact wasn't born of violence. It was a moment of profound, terrifying connection, in that instant looking at the warrior cloaked in shadow and firelight. Liza understood a devastating truth. Black Hawk had taken her captive, torn her from her home, and held her life in his hands. But it was Jeremiah Stanton with his cold diamond ring and his suffocating promises who had truly tried to put her in chains. Black Hawk had taken her body, but Jeremiah had wanted her soul. And as Liza clutched her father's ledger to her chest, she wasn't sure which was the greater crime. The lines were blurring, the world shifting beneath her feet, and the fierce woman who thought she knew everything was beginning to realize she knew nothing at all. The weeks bled into a month. Liza's shoulder healed, leaving a puckered, angry scar that she would carry forever. Her hands once soft from her sheltered life as the ranch owner became calloused and strong. She learned to tan hides until they were supple to cook over an open fire, to speak enough of the Comanche language to understand conversations and make her own needs known. The tether on her hands was eventually removed, a silent acknowledgement of a trust she had neither asked for nor expected. She was still a captive, but the nature of her captivity had changed. It was less a prison and more a strange, disorienting purgatory between two worlds. Her relationship with Black Hawk remained a landscape of tension and unspoken truths. They orbited each other like a binary star system, bound by a gravity of shared circumstance and a strange, burgeoning respect. He would watch her, his expression inscrutable, as she learned a new skill from his mother, or played a simple game with the camp children. She, in turn, saw the weight he carried as a war chief, the burden of his people's survival etched into the lines on his face. She saw his grief for his brother, a wound that refused to heal. She was no longer the fierce woman from Redemption, nor was she one of the Nokona. She was something in between, a ghost haunting the edges of two lives belonging to neither. The hatred she had once felt for her captor had dissolved, replaced by a complex and unsettling mix of fear, gratitude, and a deeply reluctant attraction. He was the most dangerous man she had ever known, and yet in his presence she felt a strange sense of safety she had never felt with Jeremiah. With Black Hawk there were no lies. His world was brutal, but it was honest. The inevitable confrontation came on a hot, windy afternoon. A scout, his horse lathered in sweat, galloped into the canyon, shouting a single, chilling word. Soldiers. But Liza knew better. It wouldn't be soldiers. It would be Jeremiah. She had seen the way Black Hawk's scouts had been watching the southern horizon, the tension that had been building in the camp for days. The trap was set. The bait was about to be taken. Panic and action erupted in the camp simultaneously. Women grabbed their children and fled for the safety of the caves higher up the canyon walls. The warriors, their faces already streaked with war paint, mounted their ponies, their movements a blur of deadly efficiency. She who remembers grabbed Liza's arm, her old eyes wide with fear. Come, you must hide. But Liza stood frozen, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Hide, while the people who had, in their own way, shown her more honesty than her own kind, were about to be slaughtered. This wasn't an army attack. It was an extermination party. Jeremiah wouldn't be coming to rescue her. He would be coming to wipe out the witnesses to his crimes and reclaim his property. If he found her here alive, what would he do? He would silence her one way or another. Black Hawk rode toward her, his face a grim mask. On his hip was a new trophy, a gleaming Winchester rifle far superior to the old muskets most of his warriors carried. He reined in his war pony, its eyes rolling wildly. Go with the women, he commanded, his voice rough. Stay out of sight, he will kill you all. She said the words catching in her throat. He has men and better rifles. You don't stand a chance in the open. This is our land, he said, his jaw set. We will choose the place of our dying. He was about to ride away when she called out, her voice ringing with a sudden shocking clarity. No, you will choose the place of your victory. He turned back, his eyes narrowing. The arroyo, she said, her mind racing, connecting her knowledge of the land with his. 2 miles east, it forks. He will follow the main channel. But the North Fork circles back. You can trap them. An ambush from both sides. She knew that terrain like the back of her hand. She had ridden it 100 times. He stared at her, shock warring with suspicion on his face. She, a white woman, his captive, was offering him military strategy. Why, he asked, the single word hanging between them. Because I will not be his property, she answered, her voice trembling with the force of her conviction. And I will not stand by and watch him butcher people to cover his own sins. My father taught me to fight for what is right. For a long time, I thought that was my land. I was wrong. It's this." She swept a hand around, indicating the canyon. "The people, the desperate fight for survival. This is what is right." A silent, profound understanding passed between them. In that moment, she was no longer his captive. She was his ally. He gave a sharp nod. "Take this," he said, tossing her a pistol and a pouch of ammunition from his saddle. "Stay with my mother. Protect her." It was the ultimate sign of trust. He was arming his prisoner. The battle, when it came, was a chaotic symphony of thunder and death. From the relative safety of a high ledge, Liza watched Jeremiah's posse, a rough collection of hired guns and greedy townsfolk, ride arrogantly into the arroyo. They rode into the trap just as she had predicted. The Comanche war cries erupted from the canyon walls, a terrifying, ululating sound that was designed to break a man's spirit before the first arrow flew. The ambush was perfect. The posse was thrown into chaos, caught in a deadly crossfire. But Jeremiah was a cunning fighter. He rallied his men, forming a defensive circle, their superior firepower taking a heavy toll on the Comanche warriors. The fighting was brutal, close quarters, and desperate. Liza, her heart in her throat, watched Black Hawk lead the charge. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of deadly grace, his Winchester barking death. She saw him go down, his horse shot from under him. He was on foot, exposed. Jeremiah saw it too. He raised his rifle, taking careful aim at the warrior who stood between him and his empire. A primal scream tore from Liza's throat. Without thinking, she raised the pistol Black Hawk had given her. It was a long shot, almost impossible, but her father had taught her to shoot. Her hands were steady. Her eye was clear. She remembered his words. "Don't aim at the man. Aim at the space he's about to occupy. Squeeze, don't pull." She fired. The world seemed to slow down. She saw the puff of smoke from her own gun, and then across the canyon she saw Jeremiah stumble. He didn't fall. He just stopped. He looked down at his own chest, a look of comical surprise on his face as a dark stain spread across his shirt. He looked up, his pale eyes, searching, and for a heart-stopping second, she thought he saw her. Then he crumpled to the ground. The fall of their leader broke the posse's will. They scattered, fleeing in a panicked rout, harried by the victorious Comanche. The silence that descended was more profound than the noise that had preceded it. It was the silence of exhaustion, of grief, of victory. Later, as the sun set, Black Hawk came to her. His arm was in a sling, and a fresh gash ran along his cheekbone. But he was alive. He stopped before her, his dark eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't name. It was a mixture of awe, gratitude, and something deeper, something that mirrored the wild, tumultuous feeling in her own chest. He reached out, not with his wounded arm, but with his good one. He didn't grab her or command her. He gently, reverently touched the scar on her shoulder, the one his arrow had made. His thumb traced its shape. "They called you too fierce to love," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They were fools. Your fire is not a thing to be feared or broken. It is a thing to be honored. It is the same fire that burns in me." And then he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of conquest or possession. It was a kiss of equals, of survivors, of two souls who had been forged in the same fire. It was rough and desperate and achingly tender. It tasted of dust and blood and gunpowder the flavor of their new shared world. In his arms, Liza felt not captive, but free. Her chains, the ones she never even knew she was dragging, had finally, irrevocably, been broken. He hadn't just claimed her. He had seen her, and in doing so had given her back her own soul. The aftermath of the battle was not one of jubilant celebration. It was a solemn, somber affair. The Comanche had been victorious, but they had paid a price. Funerary rites were performed for the 3 warriors who had fallen, their bodies wrapped in buffalo hides and placed on high scaffolds to return to the sky. The women's keening cries echoed through the canyon, a haunting melody of loss that settled deep in Liza's bones. She stood on the periphery, a respectful observer, understanding that this grief, like all things in their world, was a shared burden. Jeremiah Stanton's body and those of his men were stripped of their weapons and left for the scavengers. It was a brutal end, but it was the justice of the plains. There was no room for sentiment when it came to a mortal enemy. Liza felt nothing as she watched them drag his body away. No pity, no remorse, only the quiet final closing of a dark chapter in her life. The man who had sought to own her was now being reclaimed by the land he had tried to conquer. In the days that followed, a profound shift occurred. Liza was no longer a captive or a curiosity. She was the white woman with the spirit of a warrior, the one who had turned the tide of the battle, the one their war chief had claimed with a public kiss that had sealed her fate more surely than any chains. The suspicion in the women's eyes was replaced by a grudging respect, and the children once shy would now approach her with small gifts, a pretty stone, a bird's feather. She moved into Black Hawk's teepee. It was an unspoken, mutual decision. Their nights were a landscape of discovery, a raw and passionate exploration of the connection that had been forged between them. In the darkness, stripped of their roles as warrior and outcast, they were simply a man and a woman. He would trace the lines of her face, as if memorizing a map, and she would learn the landscape of his body, the scars that told the story of his life. He taught her the names of the stars in the Comanche language, and she in turn told him stories of her father, sharing the memories that were her most precious possessions. But their new world was not without its own challenges. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Black Hawk looked at her, his expression serious. "My scouts have returned from your town," he said quietly. "Stanton's death is known. They believe the Comanche killed him and took you. They think you are dead or worse." Liza absorbed this news. A part of her should have felt a pang of loss, but the world of redemption felt like a distant country, a life that had belonged to someone else. "What of my ranch?" she asked. Stanton had no direct heir. The lawmen, the town council. They are vultures picking at the bones of his empire. They will absorb his land. And yours. A woman presumed dead has no claim. The Circle T is gone. She had expected it, but the finality of it still stung. The land of her father, the taste of its dust, the work of her own hands, all of it gone. She looked down at her calloused hands, so different from the hands that had once managed ledgers. Black Hawk watched her, his eyes full of a fierce tenderness. "You grieve for it." "It was my home," she whispered. "Home is not a piece of land," he said, taking her hand in his. His grasp was warm and strong. "Home is a people. Home is a fire to sit by. Home is here." He touched his chest over his heart. if you choose it. And that was the question that lay between them, unspoken but immense. What was her choice? The path back to the white world was closed to her now. They would never understand. To them, she would be a ruined woman, a savage's prize tainted by her time with the Comanche. She would be an outcast, pitied and scorned, forced back into a different kind of cage. Here she was respected. Here her fierceness was a virtue. Here she was loved not in spite of her strength, but because of it. But it would be a hard life. A life of constant movement, of hunger, and cold, of fighting for survival in a world that was shrinking every day. It was a life balanced on the edge of a knife. A few days later, she gave him her answer. She was sitting with She Who Remembers, mending one of Black Hawk's shirts with a bone needle. Her stitches were still clumsy, but they were strong. She looked up and saw him watching her from across the camp. She met his gaze and gave him a small, deliberate nod. A slow smile spread across his face, a rare and beautiful sight that transformed his stern features. It was all the confirmation he needed. That night they held a ceremony. It wasn't a wedding in the way her people would have understood it. There were no rings, no vows before a preacher. She was dressed in a soft doe-skin dress, decorated with intricate quill work by She Who Remembers. Black Hawk stood before his people, his hand resting on her shoulder, and simply declared, "She is my wife. Her heart is no Kona now. Her name is no longer Liza. Her name is Isapai Wolf Woman, for her spirit is as strong and wild as the wolf that fights for its pack." She was given a new name, a new identity. She was reborn in the heart of the canyon, under a blanket of stars, more brilliant than any diamond Jeremiah Stanton could have offered. Their life was not easy. The world continued to close in. The blue-coated soldiers came ever more frequently, and the buffalo grew scarcer. There were times of great hardship, of bitter cold and gnawing hunger. There were moments when Liza felt a deep, aching homesickness for things she could no longer have a soft bed. A chapter read by a warm fire, the easy comfort of her old life. But then Black Hawk would come to her, his hand finding hers in the darkness, his presence a steady anchor in their turbulent world. She would watch him teach their son a boy, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's fierce, determined spirit, how to track a deer. And she knew she had made the right choice. She had traded a life of comfortable confinement for one of perilous freedom. She had lost a ranch but had gained a nation. They had called her too fierce to love. But here in the heart of the wound-untamed plains, she had found a love as fierce and enduring as the land itself. And as she stood beside her husband, looking out over the vast, wind-swept horizon, she knew she was finally, truly home. The chains were gone, and her soul was free to soar. Eliza's story is more than a tale of survival in the Old West. It's a powerful testament to the true meaning of freedom and the courage it takes to define your own destiny. She discovered that the most dangerous prisons are not the ones with visible bars, but the gilded cages of expectation and control. Her journey from captive to warrior forces us to ask, what does it truly mean to be civilized? And who gets to decide what chains, seen or unseen, are holding you back from embracing your own fierce spirit? If her journey resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of stories about unbreakable spirits, please show your support for this channel. Take a second to hit that like button. It truly helps us reach more people, Share this video with someone who needs to hear a story of courage, and most importantly, subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next journey into the heart of history. Thank you for listening.